So welcome to Grimdark. We're going to be talking about some suggestions and ideas and things for writing more graphic or more dark or more terrifying things and still be able to tell a compelling story that readers want to enjoy as they're going through it. My name is Maxwell Drake. I'm a novelist, screenplay writer. Really, I was the lead fiction writer for a massive game from Sony for a couple years, but for the last several years I've been doing TV and movies. So that's really kind of where I'm at. This is my first panel of the con, and yet I spent the last 6 months writing a children's movie. So I'm like, oh yeah, right, Grimdark. I got to think about that. You guys introduce yourselves.
Yeah, I'm Christopher Husberg. I write dark epic fantasy, which I don't know if I wouldn't technically qualify it as grimdark, but it's darker. And I love to read grimdark. And generally, I just really appreciate stories that they go to dark places, and we'll probably get into why that is later in the panel, but I'm a big fan, and I also write dark fantasy.
Tony?
I'm Tony Daniel. I am a writer, and I'm senior editor at Baen Books as well. Written a great many short stories and novels over the years, and a couple of movies, one on Chiller recently was up. And this is one of those panels I have no idea why they put me on, but I certainly,
scary looking.
as an editor, I am scary.
As an editor, yeah, that's true. Yeah,
I'm one of Larry Correa's editors. The House of Assassins, Son of the Black Sword, that was out last year. I'm the editor on those, which maybe you could consider.
Yeah.
In this genre. I also wrote a story back in the 90s that's probably made me more money than anything I ever wrote, called Dry Quiet War, which is sort of science fiction, post-apocalyptic, end of the world, incredibly dark. Guy pulling a guy's intestines out and watching him die kind of story. So there you go.
Cool.
Well, obviously, Chris was more prepared than I was, so why don't we let you?
Yeah, I can kind of direct things a little bit.
That'd be nice.
So, I guess I'm going to kind of look at some of these questions real quick, but I think we'll just start. Let's give a few examples of our favorite works, grimdark works, if we're familiar with any, I guess, and just talk about why we like them, what aspects of them make them grimdark.
You better start on that.
Yeah.
Go for it.
So I don't consider myself a grimdark fan. I mean, my novels, I am kind of famous for writing blood and gore, but I really am more attracted to tragedy as opposed to the more horrific grimdark. So for me, I don't write grimdark, and I'm not necessarily a fan of reading grimdark. I like horrific scenes or horrific violence or whatever to push a point. So I never write violence just to write violence. Like I would never write something like Saw or something like that, where the violence is really kind of takes center stage. But I do, like when I am writing a fight scene or when I am writing a tragic scene or something like that, if I really need the audience to be pushed down a very horrific path, for me it's always about, it's not glorifying the violence, it's about making the reader cringe and go, man, I am so happy I'm not in that environment, and how horrible would it be to be in that environment, because I want the reader to feel that. So that's kind of how I use my stuff. So I am a fan of the tragedies. Seven, you might consider a grimdark type tale, but really it's a tragedy. It's all about dealing with the human psyche and the depths of human evil and so on and so forth. So it pushes the story through that as opposed to glorifying the violence. It was never about that, because the story's about a guy trying to stop all this stuff. So that's really kind of how I see it.
Well,
Go for it.
Well, I think, this sort of thing harks back to like the great Jack Vance kind of Dying Earth books, where there is just there's no morality in a either fantastic or far future setting, I would say, where it everything is stripped of the values that we assign to them down to what there actually is. And a lot of the times the heroes are stoics, people who have a sort of stoic sensibility, and that is the value system that can arise in such an environment. And it's not just limited to dark fantasy. You could see it in say the Reacher books. That guy's a stoic in a very dark world where bad things are happening a lot. You have to beat your way out of situations. Beat your opponent up until they give you the solution to the mystery you're trying to solve. And generally, your heroes are after a certain nobility that only they can define.
Cool.
In Larry's book, House of Assassins, which is out, the sequel to Son of the Black Sword, his character is very much like that. He has lost all sense of... he used to be an enforcer of what was called the law. It's an atheistic world where it's sort of based on the hierarchy of ancient India. What he's done is he's the only place he can find any kind of reason to go forward is to keep his word, because it's the only thing that means anything to him anymore. It's a great. I'll show you the cover, by the way. I should bring my own. I should bring books I want to show. There we go. This is out this month, by the way. Larry's going to be here, by the way, on Friday. So,
cool. Yeah, so I think that's an interesting thing to bring up, kind of the stoic lone protagonist, right? Which actually really, it's definitely a trope of the Grimdark category. You usually have your main character that just has lost a lot or everything, and because of that, they sort of have nothing else to live for. I'll just go through some of my favorite examples of Grimdark really quickly. Grimdark goes back kind of far. You have novels like The Black Company by Glenn Cook, and what's Covenant? Thomas Covenant, I think. Those are pretty.
I don't know if
pretty damn dark.
I wouldn't consider them.
I don't know if they're grimdark, but I think those are maybe proto grimdark, you could say.
Right. If he cuts himself shaving, it becomes grimdark.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
His leprosy kicks in.
I think sort of the figurehead for a few people are sort of figureheads for Grimdark right now. One is Joe Abercrombie, who is one of my favorite authors. He's written things like the First Law trilogy, Best Served Cold, Red Country, some fantastic stuff. Definitely has this stoic. One of the characters, it's epic. It's a grimdark epic fantasy. So one of the characters is absolutely this kind of lone stoic protagonist, but he has a large cast of other characters who are equally. One of my favorites is a torturer. One of the main characters is a torturer who just tortures people for information.
Is it Abercrombie is the name?
Abercrombie is his last name, Joe Abercrombie.
The First Law series.
Yep. And he's fantastically written, a very, very complex character. And it's one of those characters that you sort of, you hate him, but the more you read about him, the more you learn about him, the more you start to sympathize with him. And actually, at least this is my experience reading a lot of Grimdark, as I sympathize with these characters who do terrible things, it makes me question, why am I sympathizing with this person? And it's a very interesting process to kind of read this book and sympathize or attempt to sympathize with some of these characters. I'd also recommend Mark Lawrence. Definitely his Prince of Thorns trilogy is, or I can't remember what exactly the trilogy name is, but the first book is Prince of Thorns. That's absolutely grimdark. He's also written some other books that I like even more than that trilogy: Red Sister, Gray Sister, and I think Holy Sister is the third one. But those I don't think are actually grimdark, which you could read them for yourself and decide. And that's something we'll get to, I think, in a few minutes that Tony's already touched on. Is it Tony?
Yeah.
Yeah. Which is what exactly defines grimdark to begin with. But a few others. R. Scott Bakker. The Prince of Nothing trilogy is probably the darkest I can think of. That's really dark stuff. I think Joe Abercrombie is kind of the figurehead, I would say.
Right.
But R. Scott Bakker is darker.
What are your books, and why would they be differentiated from this?
So that's an interesting question. I think I think more than anything, what sets grimdark, a little bit further along the spectrum, if we think of it as a spectrum from like dark fantasy, is nihilism. Almost all grimdark I read that is true grimdark, there is, there's no sense of like, a higher power or justice in the world that these characters live in, and that's the tone, right? That is the rule, the golden rule that these characters go by. That every action, there's not going to be justice for anything.
Right.
People die, they're not going to get, they're not going to be avenged. If you try to avenge them, you're going to be worse off than you were before, and that's just kind of the cycle of these books. And I would say that the difference for me is because I like to write dark scenes. I like to write books with elements of horror in them. But I also, Drake kind of mentioned this earlier. He writes these scenes to prove a point, right? To make a point, to progress the story. And I do that for kind of the same reason, and also because I think the lower, the darker I go, the more significant those bright moments are, right? And I love that. I love that the difference between how dark things can get and how triumphant things can be after the darkness, right? I love that. That's what I love. And Grimdark usually doesn't have that, right? It usually has the really dark moment, and then kind of you may sort of resolve a little bit, but it gets less dark. Yeah.
What's the name of your series? By the way?
Oh yeah, sure. The Chaos Queen Quintet is the series I'm writing. Duskfall is the first book. And then there's a few. Oh, one other example. You mentioned that it's not just fantasy, right? The Netflix show Altered Carbon. I think you could qualify that as grimdark, and definitely has again, lone protagonist. It's very bloody and violent. I think the ending is maybe not quite as dark as some grimdark, but I think it falls towards that end of the spectrum.
You really did, and I totally forgot about Abercrombie. I haven't read it since it came out, so probably 20 years ago. But I totally had forgotten about the torture because the story doesn't really follow the torture. It follows this other group of adventurers that are on this epic quest. So the torture is more of a watching what's going on at home while these guys are out and doing their thing. But that is a great example of grimdark, because you have this character who is morally bankrupt, who does a job that has, that is one of the worst, most despicable things you could possibly do as a human. Because he literally has, when you meet him, he's devolved to the point, which you'd have to. He's so numb that there is no humanity anymore. And I remember the opening scene. As soon as you said that, I remembered his opening scene where you are looking at other human beings through this guy's eyes, and looking at them as basically not even meat at this point anymore. They are less than that to him. And I could see, it's this really quick transition to get the reader from, being a morally just human being who lives in our world into this world of your job is to basically chop people up until they give you the answers that you want, and then you kill them. There's not even a happy ending for it at the end. It's not like, give me what I need and you'll go away. It's no, I'm going to kill you anyway. So it is this weird evolution as you follow this character and kind of his struggles and his goals in life, because he does have that outside of work. He's got a personality outside of work, and then he's got his personality inside of work. Yeah. And so that's what sucks you in, and I think that's really the genesis of what kind of this panel needs to focus on, is how do you do that? How do you accomplish taking these characters that have no moral fiber, no moral value whatsoever, and yet make them somebody that the readers appreciate and actually want to follow, and maybe even want to see succeed in the end?
Well, I think you have to give them something that they're striving for within the framework of what they actually do believe. I was thinking, for instance, Subverting in Gene Wolfe's great trilogy, Shadow of the Torturer, and those books. I forget what the whole thing is called. He's a torturer, and it's a far future science fiction world that might as well be fantasy. And he's attempting to figure out what is going on, and what has created this world of ghost images and flowers that can kill people, and he's baffled. He's been assigned this very specific task of being a torturer, and within that he's really smart. He likes what he does, but at the same time he's aware that he's in a corner, and he's trying to find a way out of a very dark place that he has no clue how to get out of, and so he's moving around and bouncing. The same, another example would be Susan R. Matthews' great series called Under Jurisdiction, which I'm now her editor. We picked it up and republished it. This has a torturer who is in a space navy in a very far future empire, which is really cool. He is named Andrew Kosciuszko, and that's his job. He is a fleet inquisitor. And he gets into it like a lot. But at the same time, he's got these slaves who are controlled by governor devices who he has great sympathy for. So within the framework of his job, which he likes a lot, he has these characters he feels a lot of sympathy for, who are slaves, and he thinks, and he starts to question, like, would they do this if they didn't get shocked almost to death every time they didn't do what I said? And it starts to develop a sort of morality from scratch after you've thrown everything away, building that back up. I don't know if there's really, a world in which there is no moral value is really very interesting to storytellers.
Yeah.
I think that the idea of this is to create a landscape where archetypes are visible.
Right. Yeah.
Well, at the end of the day, you can't forget about what your job is, and that's the reader. It's connecting the characters to the readers. So, obviously, and another thing I wanted to kind of make sure that we all understand, we're not talking about secondary and tertiary characters. You can have secondary and tertiary characters that are morally bankrupt that have no growth and they're just there to do whatever they're doing. We are talking about characters that you're going to be inside the head of, that you're going to be following. And those pose some really interesting challenges from a story creation standpoint, because you still have to, at the end of the day, come down to how am I going to connect this character to the reader? Because otherwise, they're going to put it down. We've all done that. We've all started a book that we just absolutely didn't connect with anything, and we put it down. So, that's the death nail for us authors, is to have our book put down. We want them to get to the end so that they enjoy it and get, pick up the next one that we've done. So, it still comes down to that. You still have to think about that. You have to think about, okay, this guy's a torturer or whatever. He's going to do despicable things. He's killing babies, whatever your Grimdark character is. But how does he, justify it internally? And this isn't Grimdark at all, but it's sort of the same thing. And if any of us have gone through any of the literary stuff, you've read Lolita. So you're following this character that is a pedophile, and yet, it's an interesting story that compels you to continue reading it, and it's become something that we use for teaching, as a teaching tool. So you have to think about that. At the end of the day, it is still always about the reader. It's not about the cool, evil character that you've decided, is so awesome at torturing that he literally gets a boner as he's doing it. It's about connecting that character to the reader, if that reader is your main character.
So why is that character compelling? Because I'm not read that. So why are they compelling if they have these horrible things?
Well, you'd have to read them. Every one of these that are successful, and you also have to understand, for every one successful Grimdark, there are 5,000 that are failures.
Yeah.
We are talking about one of the more difficult, just like a tragedy. Writing tragedy is very, very difficult, as opposed to writing a happy ending story.
Writing jerk for main characters is difficult, but it's fun. It's the anti-hero is it's almost as hard as writing comedy, but it's what I always told my writing students is that you either have to make a character sympathetic or you have to make them interesting, if they're somebody that you want the reader to identify with and follow. Right. And so these are the characters you have to make interesting.
Yeah. One thing to keep in mind is that in a lot of ways Grimdark came about as a reaction to epic fantasy and sort of the very sharp dichotomy between good and evil that was clear in books like Lord of the Rings and the Bulgariad and these kinds of books where there's clearly bad guys and clearly good guys and not much in between, and they just kind of hash it out. And Grimdark presented a world where there really wasn't any good guys or any bad guys, and everybody was just trying to accomplish their own goals that maybe had good reasons behind them, but also bad reasons, right? And there's just this moral gray area, right, that just sort of takes over Grimdark as a reaction to kind of this epic fantasy trope. And for that reason, a lot of Grimdark, straight up, especially Joe Abercrombie's first trilogy, subverts almost every epic fantasy trope you can think of. The heroes go on a quest, and by the end of their quest, I think in the second book, spoiler alert, I guess, I'm sorry, like the thing isn't there and it never existed, and it was literally for nothing.
Right.
Like they didn't accomplish anything. There were other things that happen on the quest that make it kind of worth reading, but their goal, they failed, right? And so that kind of subversion does occur quite often in Grimdark, and specifically the main subversion is kind of, instead of this like innocent farm boy hero or whatever, you have this person who is a jerk or really just grizzled and jaded and doesn't care about much, if anything. So that's something to keep in mind, that it is a reaction, and
it's one of the reasons why a lot of Grimdark end up as tragedies. They end up as, there is no happy ending. There is no light at the end of the tunnel. So many of them in that way. And that's another reason why they don't end up being as successful commercially because the mass market wants the happy ending. We escape into a story because we want to go on a journey, and then we want to triumph at the end. Going back to like what I said about Seven, if you read the movie, or if you watched the movie Seven, it does not end in a happy, feel-good kind of way. And those are that's the hardest to pull off. Again, like I said, tragedies are the hardest type of story to accomplish and still make it enjoyable to the readers.
I did want to just address this question a little bit more. We're going to take more questions towards the end of the panel, but I just wanted to say, I think one thing that as I'm thinking about these protagonists, one thing that happens with most of them in the books is almost none of them start without morals or without humanity, right? Most of them had a family or had a life that was relatively good, and they lost all of that. So I think one of the ways that at least I feel attached to these characters is through the narrative, I learn about their past and what they had and what they lost. And because they had these things at one time, they weren't always this terrible person. That is a little bit endearing, right? Where I'm like, oh my gosh, you had these things, you lost them, that's terrible. And I sympathize with them for that reason, right? Loss, I think, is a pretty wide emotion that most people can sympathize with on one level or another, right? And I think that's one thing, as I'm thinking about most Grimdark protagonists, almost all of them, started
So just like other
relatively
genres,
well.
you're relating to them because of the pain they've gone through, and that makes the character likable.
Yeah, I think so. I think you could say that.
Or at least interesting.
Exactly. Yeah. Let me go through a couple of more of these questions, then we're going to start taking questions. Let's see. So one of the sort of staples of Grimdark that we haven't talked about a lot yet is characters, and especially protagonists, dying unexpectedly or frequently. And this sort of, I think George R. R. Martin didn't start this necessarily, but he really
capitalized on it.
Yeah, he capitalized on it absolutely, and does it quite well, I would say, in a number of ways. So characters die a lot. I mean, people die in Grimdark books, but specifically main characters, right? You have a POV character that maybe dies fairly early or unexpectedly. Unfulfilled. Yeah, their goals and their arc ends halfway through.
Like the Bud Knight in the commercial.
Like the Bud Knight in the Game of Thrones commercial. Oh, that poor guy. Super Bowl commercial, if anybody is confused.
A Grimdark.
A Grimdark Super Bowl commercial. A hybrid of Game of Thrones and Bud Light. I don't know how that happened, but
it was pretty hilarious.
Yeah, it was funny. Let's see. So, with that in mind, how do we keep readers from being kind of desensitized to characters, right? From sort of disassociating or detaching from main characters. Are there any methods either of you can think of that you or other Grimdark authors have employed to sort of still keep you continually invested in their main characters, despite kind of killing them seemingly at random?
Well, again, I don't think any of the three of us are actual Grimdark authors.
Yeah.
So, like, I've killed POV characters.
Yeah.
And actually, I have a reputation of killing POV characters, and yet I've killed one. But
Right.
just doing one.
One
you
is
do
enough.
it so much. It's like, oh my God, he kills characters. Like, like this. The next George Martin. Like, I've killed one in all these novels.
Yeah.
So, whatever. So it doesn't take a lot. But I mean, how many people are watching Game of Thrones and they introduce a new character and you're like, oh great, somebody I can get involved with? Like, how many actually say that? No.
So like, oh, that guy's.
So you get in. There is also, you know, the fall side of it where you don't care about anyone in Game of Thrones because they're all gonna die. And so I think that actually went too far. The killing of the main characters is what really, that he was the first one to really capitalize on that, and that really put him to the forefront. Everybody talking about it. If you're talking about it, you're buying it. So, you know, that's what really helped push Game of Thrones into the forefront. But like for me, I lost interest. You know, I just, at this point, there's nothing for me to relate to as a reader. I'm a character-driven reader, and I'm a character-driven writer. So if this, I don't really, as a fan, I don't really get into things that aren't character-driven. And that's the reason why I don't write Grimdark for the traditional way, because I'm a character-driven. So if there is going to be that dark moment, it's always because it's growing that character. Even when I kill the main character, and all of his, literally midstream of his plot arc, he gets killed. So he had all these goals and all these things that you as the reader had bought into, and now they're gone. But all of that was a growing moment for another character in the story who then picked up those, you know, goals and those things and went and finished that. And he needed, you know, that character that was alive needed that growth. It was a much more dark and much stronger version of, you know, Luke seeing Obi-Wan die, the guy he met last week. So this was a much more, you know, in-depth, emotional thing, but it's the same plot device. So
Yeah, and there's something to be said for, you know, again, like I said, George R. R. Martin is basically the poster child for this. But he, you know, he does kill off a lot of characters, but if you're keeping track, at least in the TV series, you know, Daenerys, Jon, Tyrion, they're all still alive.
It's pretty easy to tell who's not going to die.
It's pretty, yeah, and that's, you know, who knows what'll happen at the end, I guess. But
if they're downtrodden and somehow horribly crippled either emotionally or physically, they're probably not going to die.
Right.
It's only when they start to gain any sort of self-respect and mastery are they in danger.
Which is why Ned Stark was the first to go.
Right.
Yep.
Because he was awesome in every way.
Yes.
That's right.
Yeah.
So,
and I would argue that as a writer, there's kind of only so far you can go before you basically lose any semblance of an audience.
Right.
Because I think that the true Grimdark audience is a pretty small subset of like general fantasy readership. And it's small because most fantasy readers just don't want to see that much violence, that much nihilism, you know, that much death of like central characters. And I think so kind of the more you do that, and that's an artistic choice you can absolutely make.
Right.
But you know, sort of
it was
economically speaking,
Abercrombie's books.
Yeah.
Was because it was one of the very first that was the series. I mean, literally, I bought it because all my friends were like, "Oh my god, I can't believe this series! The heroes don't win at the end." And I went, "There's no way they made an epic fantasy where a 3-book epic fantasy saga where the heroes don't win at the end.
The ending is so bleak." Oh my!
And I read it and I was like, "Oh, okay, yeah, sure."
Yeah.
And that's one of the reasons why I'm not a reader of that, because that's not my, you know. And the Abercrombie stuff was a brilliant read, and I recommend that you read it.
Yeah.
But it's not what I read as a fan.
The fun part about these sort of characters is a lot of times they're funny and cynical, and the cynicism can be a big draw. It's really easy to identify with cynicism, especially after you're 30. You know, so I expect an older audience for Grimdark. But this just goes back. It's nothing new, really. You know, Conan's like this.
Yeah.
Like I said, Jack Vance's Dying Earth stuff's so brilliant, so wonderful. Go read it, please. You know, there's no values in a Jack Vance world that are anything we recognize. They arise out of the situation. And a lot of the compelling thing about say Westeros is Westeros. The thing that Martin couldn't get rid of when he was subverting Tolkien was the wonderful setting, and because that is the main character in Tolkien, and it's the main character in Game of Thrones, and you can't subvert setting in fantasy, and Grimdark I don't think really does subvert setting in that it's still a fantasy world. There's still there's still swords, stuff like that. A lot of times the incredible bad part of the Dark Ages is brought out instead of the fun adventure part. Yeah.
Yeah.
So the fact that you would die like 2 days from a toothache,
Right.
and things like that. So I don't want to go back there,
Yeah.
but it might be fun to read.
So we have like 15. So maybe let's start taking questions if there are any. Yeah.
So something that I like in certain types of Grimdark is, like you were talking about how a lot of the time there's this, like there's not a higher power, or there's this feeling there isn't. There's like no justice. But I think that there can be like a kind of humanistic quality to the story, and those are the kinds that I like the best, are the ones where the characters start to define their own morality.
What's an example of your?
The Walking Dead.
Yeah. I think, so this is kind of along lines of what you're saying, but one of the, grimdark fantasy, in a lot of ways, is more realistic than other fantasy. Not in the, I wouldn't say in the sense that, like, the world is grimdark or anything like that. But one of the ways to kind of develop a grimdark tone in a book is to be very detail oriented and mainly focusing on like the sucky details of life. Like, this soldier is walking along and he's sweating in his armor and it smells awful and it doesn't fit him and there's flies buzzing all around him and he really has to take a piss but there's nowhere to do it, and that sort of feel is like pretty typical for a grimdark novel. And so in that sense, I think Grimdark, you could say, is more realistic in the sense that it at least talks about some of the, less glamorous aspects of life. Whereas a lot of high, like, epic fantasy, one of the reasons a lot of readers read that is to get away from that kind of a thing.
It's an escape.
Yeah, it's an escape.
But, your point is exactly going to what I made earlier. If you are going to write Grimdark, if this is the zone that you want to write in, not only is it probably going to be a smaller, more niche market, but it still comes down to the human elements. It still comes down to you have to connect with that reader. The reader has to connect to the characters, has to connect to the story, has to connect with the plight of the story. And I know I keep hammering on the seven drum, but that's what makes that so amazing of a ride for the audience, is because you are there with that, with Brad Pitt's character, and you really do want to see him succeed. So when he fails at the end, like, it crushes you as the audience member because you were there. You were a part of that whole thing. And it's that human connection, even though it's a tragedy, even though it's horribly graphic and the absolute abyss of what humans could do to each other, it is still that human connection with this other person, and you experience that pain with him as he goes through that makes that connection with you. So no matter what genre you're writing in, whether it's the Grimdark or what we're writing or whatever, you still have to always come back to understanding that it's about the reader and connecting them to the story. And that's one of the reasons why I don't write Grimdark, because that's a tough thing. Like Abercrombie, that torture, now that you mentioned, I'm probably have to go back and read that, because it really was a completely forgotten character to me, but one that was amazing that I remember. And going back to the Game of Thrones, that story is really about the villains. It started, it had this facade that it was going to be about the good guys, and it's like, here, let me introduce Stark and let me introduce all these really awesome hero types. But that was really, I feel like, a trick to get you interested into the story. And the story was about, I'm now rooting for Jaime, and I hate that. I hate rooting for Jaime because I love hating him. He was the perfect villain. And now, he loses a hand and he starts to figure things that he might have been doing things wrong, and, he's going on this quest of his own, and you really do start going, man, I want to see him succeed now. And I hate that. I don't want to see him succeed. So that's that transition that's very difficult. So if you are going to be in this genre, that's really the takeaway, is that you have to understand that you're writing in an environment that's very difficult, and you're going to have to really push yourself as a creator to work on those hooks, to make sure that those readers do connect with those characters, so that they do root for your character, going, I don't want to root for this guy, but I'm doing it anyway. So
yeah, let's go. We've got some more questions. We'll go here and then there.
Well, it's like a weird question.
Okay.
But I was thinking of Oedipus Rex.
Yeah.
And like at the end, he's poking his eyes out,
Yeah.
he's bleeding. There's really no redemption at the end of the story.
Yeah.
I was thinking this really has been going on for a long time.
Yeah.
Basically, Grimdark's been in our culture.
Oh, I mean, the entire Grimm fairy tales.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Like the actual fairy tales
Right.
where
Not
nothing
the
ends
American
well.
version.
Yeah,
Right.
where
Yeah.
things are
Yeah.
really
Red
violent
Hot Shoes
and
until she
weird.
died.
Right.
Yeah. And
Humans have always been attracted to the worst of humanity.
Right.
Like, because if you're not in it, if you're a normal human being that cares about others and, wants to treat strangers well and all that, it's a guilty pleasure to go into this story that's completely fake and safe. It is safe for a reader to go into these stories or watch these TV shows like The Walking Dead. And so that's a really fun escapism to go, to watch to kind of think about how would I be in this environment? Would I go? I mean, when we meet Rick in Walking Dead, he's this, upstanding cop, and then they get to that prison scene and they've gone through all this crap, and he's like, I still should uphold the law. And these criminals are like, no, this is our place. And so they are fighting the zombies. Remember, they had that argument and the zombies come in? You might not remember, but so you have this cop, and that's the moment where he changes. Because he's like, shoot zombie, shoot guy in the back of the head that I was arguing with, shoot zombie. I mean, he murders the guy in cold blood because they were arguing over who was going to get the location before the zombies came in. And that was an amazing moment for this character in his growth plan to go, I'm trying to stay with this old world, this old, lawful society that I come from. And that's the moment where he goes, that world is dead. And I now have to make my own kind of morality. And that moment was just breathtakingly beautifully written. So these are the things that you're going to have to push yourself when you're looking at doing these genres and going into the darker moments.
yeah. If you're familiar with the D&D alignment sort of grid, Grimdark is like just the bottom third, right? It's like chaotic evil, neutral evil, lawful evil. That's Grimdark. Oh yeah.
Taking Grimdark as this cultural reaction to epic high fantasy Tolkien, and maybe living in a world where we sort of lost a sense of trust in the powers that be and structures and maybe faith systems that we've had traditionally in the West. Do y'all think, understanding that y'all aren't necessarily Grimdark writers yourselves, that genre is a sustainable thing, or that's a George R. R.
Oedipus Rex.
Yeah.
But that isn't Grimdark, because there is a higher power, there is eternal justice, there's a moral center being.
But I'm still saying it's still about looking at the dark side of humanity. And I think that's really what Grimdark is kind of there for. Is it ever going to be as mass, market as epic fantasy or romance or anything? There's probably not. But will it ever go away? I doubt it. There are people that, and especially the more advanced we get in society and the more lawful we get as a society, the more our escapism is going to want to, go to those. I mean, the height of the death count in the Roman Colosseum was at the height of their prosperity when they actually were becoming a civilized society. And the more civilized they became, the more violent and brutal and bloody their sports became. Because we want that escape.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at the show Deadwood, for instance, which is about civilization rising,
Right, building.
is in the wilderness or whatever.
Yes.
Is it's a Western existential grim dark sort of thing, and it's the greatest TV show ever. And by the way, there's a frickin' Deadwood movie coming out in April. But I think that if you understand what fantasy is and you think about it a little bit, fantasy to me is a representation of internal, I wouldn't call it morality, ethical codes of people. And you are the bad guy as well as the good guy when you're reading a fantasy novel. You're Sauron as well as Bilbo. This is things inside of you that are archetypical and that are shared by humans. And I think that the grimdark side of things and the darker side of dark fantasy explores just the darker side of humanity that's in everyone. So I don't think there's any and like I said, it's been rising for forever. People have been telling these kind of stories. Another one's Fritz Leiber. I was thinking about the Fafhrd and Grey Mouser stories.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's always, if you can find the right way to tell it, there's an audience.
Yeah.
Because it's us, it's somewhere in us is all of these sides.
I think there will absolutely always be a niche audience for Grimdark, and for a while, a few years ago, I think it has faded now. For a while, there was a significant and kind of growing audience for Grimdark. And there are still new Grimdark books coming out. I think Anna Smith Spark is a pretty solid name in Grimdark these days. I think her first novel is something about knives. I cannot remember. Anna Smith Spark. But I will say a lot of the books that sort of. Oh, by the way, if you just want to experience and jump into Grimdark sort of culture and readership, just join the Grimdark Facebook group. There's like thousands of people on it, and they post pretty frequently about book recommendations, that kind of thing. Very easy way just to kind of get a taste of what it's like. 5 minutes. Okay, thank you. But I will say I think it's kind of declining. Like I think it's sort of had its.
Well, I don't think it's declining. I think that's the natural way.
Ebb and
of all
flow.
genres. It's
Sure.
It's an ebb and a flow.
Sure.
Vampires come, vampires go. Vampires come. Grimdark comes, it goes, it comes.
Yeah.
But I don't think it's ever going to go away.
Yeah. I don't think
there's
we're gonna...
times where it's more prevalent, times where it's a little weaker. But that's me with Grimdark. I can't read. Like, I could never just read Grimdark.
Yeah.
Like, I can read, one and have an enjoyable time, and then move on to something a little lighthearted, and something a little bit more whatever, and then come back to it later on. Hannibal, the TV show
Unless you're,
Hannibal.
like, psyching yourself up for your suicide.
Well, exactly. But no, Hannibal on the TV show was one of my favorite TV shows, and I watched it live. I was watching it when it was airing, and every time I would finish that, I'd have to watch an episode of Family Guy before I went to sleep because it was just so mind-numbing.
I also watched it live, but I think it would have been impossible for me to binge watch it. Like, for this reason.
Right. I don't know if
I'm glad I watched it live. Because it's a very, very, very good show.
To kind of recover after that. But I
very well produced, well written.
I literally watched the Family Guy after every episode, and then I would go to sleep. Because it is so mentally heavy and draining.
Yeah.
You want to do closing thoughts?
We got maybe time for one more question if there's... Sure.
I just wanted to know, besides like the things you already mentioned, like about a character being cynical or having humor or being likable because of whatever reasons, if there's any other element of Grimdark that they do well, or any other technique that could be applied to other genres, or just like a violent scene in general that Grimdark really gets right, that we could maybe
visceral description.
Grimdark.
Description of things that draw on realism, the tradition of realism and stuff. I think I like that. I like that in books, and it's something that I'd like to see more of in high fantasy in general. Just makes the world seem real.
I think fight scenes, it's pretty fair to say that most Grimdark books do a very good job with their fight scenes. And they're usually a little bit more different. They're a little bit more gritty, brutal than a typical epic fantasy fight scene, but that adds a lot. And I've seen a lot of epic fantasy writers take notes and sort of make their fights a little bit more brutal, a little bit more harsh. Like if this is a complete... I have a lot of issues with this scene. But compare Legolas fighting in The Lord of the Rings to Legolas fighting at the end of like the second Hobbit movie, which is, like I said, I have a lot of issues with. But he basically gets beaten up by this orc, and he's bloody and kind of brutalized. Whereas Legolas in Lord of the Rings is just like sliding all over the place, surfing down elephant trunks, shooting thousands of guys with his arrows, flawless hair after the battle. That's Legolas in Lord of the Rings. And then Legolas, so you can see kind of people taking notes from the Grimdark and sort of this brutal, but yeah, fight scenes. And I'll say particularly, any fight scene in Joe Abercrombie's books that contains the character Logan / the Bloody Nine is phenomenal. Just great fight scenes. And I think, do you want to say anything else before we close up?
We can just...
Do you want to do it? Lead us off?
Whatever. So if you are interested in how I teach, I do have some books on writing. This one's actually required reading within Disney theme parks for the guys that run their story flows. I didn't write it for theme parks. It's for writers. But it's just a cool little thing. I'm also teaching a 2-hour class on theme in the next room. So if you guys want to go deep into the theories of theme, what they are, how to use them, how they actually help you write your story, and so on and so forth, next hour I'm next door. Next 2 hours.
I'll vouch for those books. I've read them. They're great books on the theory and the craft of writing for any writer. Chris Husberg, I'll be at a number of panels throughout the weekend. I'm also doing a reading tomorrow morning with Dan Wells at 10. So if you want to come, I'd love to have you there.
Tonight, I'm going to interview. I'm going to have a Bain Traveling. I'm a podcast. I host the Bain Traveling Roadshow podcast every week. We've done 300 shows. They're great. We interview our writers. I'm going to do a remote one. I'm going to interview DJ Butler and Eric James Stone tonight in Sycamore at 6. It's not on the schedule, so we would love to have an audience, and we'll take questions and all kind of stuff. And I'm going to set up all my mics and everything. Bain Traveling Roadshow is tomorrow at 3, and I give out free books, lots of free books. And any authors that are around will talk about their books, and I'll show the art before and after. It's really fun, and it's cool. Come to see that.
Cool. All right. Well, thank you guys very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.